Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. At the end of the paragraph, the bottom of page 1371. We're middle of understanding what Beraisa is, in contrast to Mishnah. Briefly, Mishnah is Chagas, meaning the Midas Chesed word for the very transmission. But now we're talking about something that's coming into explanation. Like we said, Birurim, the world of Birurim, the world of clarity, and helping us establish what exactly is a mitzvah, so we know how to perform it. Whereas in contrast to Mikrah, which is Chabad, that remains something that you can't really live by in this world. So it's the basis of it all, but it remains, they said, L'mayla Mahasoga, higher than comprehension. That's why its expression is only the Nihi, the outer dimension of that inner force, that deeper, we'll call it more enigmatic or more transcendent energy. So it expresses itself through the simple stories and the basic mitzvahs. Mishnah, on the other hand, explains it. Mishnah relates to existence. That's why it manifests from Chagas in the world of Yetzirah. And that's why Mishnah is called both Isusa da Hainar, like the spouse, and Shifcha, the maidservant, because it's drawing the Torah down into a world of action and to a world of a tangible way of living by it. Mishnah itself then further manifests in Beraisa. Beraisa is coming from the same source, meaning it is essentially the Tanoim that are teaching it, but even though he didn't say these words, but it's like Nihi of Chagas. So it's an extension of Chagas, but it's what we call the instruments of transmission. Netzach and Hoid, and of course Yesod as well, although we didn't explain Yesod here, and I guess at page 15 he does, that it brings it down, because now it's going through a tzimtzum. Firstly, the restraint within the mashpia, in the transmitter, and secondly, the diminishment of the very flow, that it should come into the relate to the recipient and come into a paradigm that the recipient can accept, like he said, like Nigla compared to Pnimius. The last piece we learned was the Hagam. That even both, but what is the difference then between Mikrah, Mishnah, and Beraisa? She says, even though earlier we learned that Mikrah and Mishma, that Mikrah is Nihi comes Bekitzer, now we said the Mishnah is Bekitzer, and the Beraisa breaks it down into details. So what is the difference in the Kitzer of the Mikrah compared to the Kitzer of the Mishnah and compared to the details of the Beraisa, which also is in the level of Nihi? She explained that and the mile of the Mishnah is that it brings it into detail. She explained the Kitzer of Mikrah is more because it's above understanding, so it's a klal, like a concentrated point. And in the context of the recipient, it's a form of katnus. When you break it into detail in Mishnah, you're elaborating upon it. So essentially, Mikrah, therefore, is Nihi of Chabad. And he compared it to Igulim. Igulim are a higher level than Yesha. It's a transcendent level, but it's not internalized. So on one hand, it's called katnus. And it's when it comes into the internal, the Yesha, that's when it becomes godless. And the same as Mikrah and Mishnah. But nevertheless, Mikrah is rooted in a higher place. It's Nihi Shebe Elyon, like the Gulim, which is higher than Yesha. The Mishnah, on the other hand, is the Pnimius of the Tacht. What about Beraisa? Beraisa is taking the Mishnah and crumbling it, breaking it down further for the recipient. So it's not coming from a Maila. It's not like a Mikrah where it's so concentrated on such a high level. Here it's actually coming downward. Like he says, it's only because the recipient requires that you break it down in further detail. And that's why it's called Nihi, the Nihi that coming out of the Chagas of the Mishnah. Now, just to add one more point, which I should have mentioned, that in addition to Beraisa being lebar, meaning outside of like the kidneys and so on, it also is, like he brought from Ilfa, that said that everything in the Beraisa is hinted to in the Mishnah. But in the Mishnah, you have to have a Bas Seichel Gadol, someone that's a higher intelligence that can understand it from the summarized version, the condensed statement in the Mishnah. Condensed compared to the Beraisa, but actually elaborated compared to the Mikrah. compared to the written Torah. So the
That's why they didn't bother putting it into.
So the Beraisa, 1 second. So the Beraisa is also originating from the Mishnah, and it's there hinted to, alluded to, but because, like he said, the kalim of the recipients became diminished, and their seichel is not on that level, you need to elaborate more, which is the Beraisa compared to the Mishnah. Okay.
Yeah, so in other words, they didn't have to bother putting it. The sages never had to bother putting in there because it was to them these Beraisas were there, and then eventually they had a
correct. That's why indeed the Beraisa is not part of the actual Mishnah. You'll find it in the Gemara. You'll find that they'll refer to a Beraisa that was said by the Tanoim. What he's explaining here, the Beraisa was not missing from the Mishnah. It's there, but it was spelled out, so to speak, for the next generation or the next level of students who couldn't derive it straight from the Mishnah. Beraisa is somewhat of a mamutza between Mishnah and Talmud. We didn't learn about Talmud yet, but we're going to learn about it. And Beraisa is like somewhere in between. It's essentially the Tanoim of the Mishnah coming down a level further to explain something in more detail. But it's still, a Beraisa is still pretty short compared to Talmud. Talmud can be pages, and a Beraisa is still going to be relatively shorter. It's just more elaborate than the Mishnah. Yeah. So now, unless someone has any questions, I'm going to continue from the new paragraph, which here again, I question whether it should be a new paragraph or not. But bottom line is they did publish it that way. So just use it as we'll use it as a bookmark. So the bottom of page 1371, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So now, okay, so Beraisa needs further elaboration of the details. Beraisa, learning inside now. So Mikrah is Nehi Sheba Elyon. It's Nehi of Chabad. Mishnah is Chagas of Chagas, which is Pnimi Sheba Tachten. And Beraisa now is the Nehi Sheba Tachten. So we have the Nehi of the Elyon of Chabad, that's Mikrah. We have Chagas of Chagas, that's Mishnah. That means the Pnimius of the Tachten. Now we're talking about the Nehi of the Tachten, like the Chitzenius of the Tachten. So keep that in mind. So there's an Elyon, that's Chabad. There's the outer dimension of the higher level. There's the inner dimension of the lower level. And there's the outer dimension of the lower level. And that's Beraisa. And they come in more breakdown of details. And a different paradigm or a different manner than the way it is in the Mishnah. So what is that difference? In the level of the revelation, or in this case, the concealment of the Oir. In other words, a Beraisa is more concealed than a Mishnah. That's why a student of not same level of aptitude or intelligence can receive it. So the difference between Mikrah and Beraisa here, I don't know if he's going to spell it out, but let me just say it. In Mikrah, a child could also understand the story of Avram Avinu or the story of Chet Eitzadas, of Adam and Eve in the garden. But that's not due to the fact that Mikrah came down to the level of the student. That's due to the fact that Mikrah is such a high level that the only place to express itself is in a simple story. In Beraisa, it's an actual deliberate effort to bring it down to a lower level student so he should understand it. So a child doesn't necessarily understand all the depth of the Mikrah. It's just that Mikrah, because it's coming from such a high level, it can manifest and does manifest in a very simple story. Beraisa is the actual effort of the teacher, the Mishnah, teacher of Mishnah, to bring, to conceal and bring it down, which is what Netzach and Hoid we learned does. Netzach restrains the flow, Hoid limits it, diminishes it according to the containers of the student and brings it into their paradigm. And that's the Nehi Sheba Tachten. In contrast, no, there's the outer dimension of the lower level, not the inner dimension of the lower level. With Mikrah remaining, like I said, the outer of the higher level, the lower of the higher. So we're talking now lower, which is Chagas. Okay. The Oira Chochmah the light or energy of Chachma meir b'mishnah, yeser me b'braises. The wisdom, the light of wisdom of Chachma radiates more in Mishnah more than it does in the Braises. That's due to the Braises, Katnas HaKelim of the recipient, that their containers are less developed, or smaller, or less mature. Bottom line, not as developed. And that's why the Eira Chachma is more in Mishnah than in Braises, and it gets more concealed in the Braises. V'ayim mashin is bar le'il, and delve into what is said earlier. Dibra masel v'yidaber v'eira. So he's referring us to a mimer back in volume 2, page 827. They refer to it in the bottom footnote. Okay, I didn't look it up, so I'm not sure what he's referring to, but I will look it up to see what exactly is said there. Well, lechein, and therefore, and that is why Isa b'Zohar, it says in the Zohar, Shabraises hem bezman bayisheni, that the Braises were delivered in the time of the second temple. Let me just look up in the Maimer and Shavuos what he says about that. 1 second, please.
What's the name of the mimer? I tried to find it yesterday and I couldn't find it. My page
Inyan
number is
Mikrah mission of the Talmud. It's on page, as I said, 1562.
Oh, you said 1467 yesterday. Sorry. That's why I couldn't find it.
Yeah. Okay. Just 1 second. I just want to see.
I'll post it.
Okay.
I'll post it in the thread for people.
So he brings from the Maimer from Tzemach Tzedek, where he says that the Zohar says the Braises are Bizman Bayesheni. Now you could ask 1 second, when was Mishnah said that? Mishnah is also from Bizman Bayesheni. The Rabbeinu HaKodesh and the Tanoim before him and after were all from the end of the time of the Second Temple. But apparently, that's why I was looking it up. Apparently, remember, the Mishnah was only written down then, but it was always taught earlier. It was always known Torah Sheba'al Peh. So apparently, Mishnah precedes Bayesheni. That's what it looks like he's saying. I need to look into it some more, but just reading what he says. 1 second. Okay. So let's read it inside, and then we'll. So he says. So that's why the Zez and Zeh that Braises are from the second time, the Second Temple. Why? Because to the Second Temple there was a descent. Remember, he alluded to it already earlier, that the seichel of the students became more diminished. And that's why the Tanoim had to teach it. That's why it was taught in the form of a Beraisa. So now he's elaborating more on that. Because during the time of the Second Temple, compared to the First Temple, Yarda B'chinas Malchus descended, was lowered, L'slabish ba'ayin sorim, to manifest in the 70 ministers. Ayin Sarim refers to the 70 ministers of the nations of the world. 70 nations. On Sukkot, the offerings, we said the Musaf every day, adds up to 70 offerings that correspond to the 70 nations. So in general, the nations of the world, all, even though there are many more, but in general, they included in 70. And those 70 each have their angel, they have their minister, their Sar, their spiritual ministers. So Ayin Sarim is an expression used in Kabbalah primarily, but also I think in Medrash probably. The idea that when Malchus manifests itself as it goes into Biyah, into a lower level, so Ayin Sarim is considered a descent. I just want to see the language by the Tzemach Tzedek. Yeah. Ayin Sodim, that's the acronym. The 70 ministers, Levader B'chinas Neiged Asiya. So let me explain. When you learn Kabbalah and Chassidus, you come to understand that the different, just like we're learning about Mikrah, Mishnah, Talmud, there are actually different levels of spiritual revelation. There are different levels of divine expression. The same thing is the history, the chronology of history also is not just different times in the different periods of history, but each one represents another level of divine revelation. For example, you may have heard the expression "Ikvas de Mashiach," that we are now in the time of the footsteps of Mashiach. Well, what does that mean, the footsteps? So most people interpret it very simple. Footsteps, that we're hearing the footsteps. Mashiach is about to come. But it's more than that. Akev is the heel of the body. So Kabbalah explains, and some of it is in Tanya chapter 2, later in Ageres Akedah, the Alter Rebbe speaks about it, that history itself, the march of time, actually is structured like a human body, like an organism. Just like all the Seder Shtalshlus, our organism created in the divine image is shaped in the image of the divine. So there's actually divine revelations. When you say something is Rosh, the head of something, like Rosh Hashanah, it's not just the beginning of the year, it's the head of the year. It's a higher state. It's the central nervous system of the year. When you say something is the guf, you say it's the middle stage. When you say something is the regel, you mean the lower stage. So in Kabbalah and elaborated in Chassidus, you'll find that Adam Harishon was the Reish. All the neshamas were included in the head, which is Adam Harishon. And as the generations go down, each generation corresponds to another part of the so-called human body, with Reish being the top, Regel, Akev being the end, and everything in between. So when we talk about, let's say, Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, it's two stages in this revelation. That's why the Avodah, the service and the work of each generation corresponds to its level. Another point to be made that just adds to it, the Ramban, Nachmanides writes in Beraisa, Chassidus brings it, the Rebbe brings it quite often, that the 7 millennia, which we know correspond to the 7 days of the week, from Sunday through Shabbos. So the Elef HaShvi, Shabbos is the millennia of Mashiach. The 6 millennia, Shit Al Fishnin, like the 6 days of the week, with the first millennia associated with Chesed, like Sunday, the second associated with Gvura, Monday, and so on. So when you talk about it, you see there too that it's also levels of revelation. And the point going back to what we're learning here is that Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni were two different levels of revelation. That's why in Bayis Sheni we didn't have the Aron, the ark, with 5 things missing in the second temple. And in general, even though the second temple was larger and stood for another 10 years, 410 years was the first, the second was 420, and it was actually a larger physical temple. In many ways, that has a quality, but in some ways, the divine revelation in the second temple was more diminished. In the language of Kabbalah, that's called Hislapshus of Malchus in the Ayin Sodim, which is the 70 ministers. Levader b'chinas nega da'asiya. They go further down to be mevader, to refine, to separate, to elevate the noiga, which is klipas noiga, not shalosh klipas klipas noiga, the radiant klipa. So it's a klipa on one hand, but it's a radiant one. It means it's transparent. It's a translucent one, and of Asiya. That's the language in Kabbalah Chassidus to explain the state of revelation in Bayis Sheni. And this is why Beraisa was revealed then. V'zeu gamkein Beraisa loshen chutz. And that's also why Beraisa means, from the word bar, we said chutz, outside of. What's chutz? So generally when we say something is within, that's in the domain of kedusha, of holiness. When you say chutz, you mean outside of the domain of holiness. Okay. Shehu islapshus b'bchinas chutz. That means it's a manifestation in the level of chutz. If you recall, when he first started, he said kamoshi is boer. He said that Beraisa, besides the fact that was taught that let me just read inside where he said the words. He said Beraisa, previous page, at the bottom of the page, he said, Nehi shein chutz megufay mehusay shalzah kehen lashpia shazel chutz matzmusay, because there's to transmit outside of the core, like we learned outside of the Mishnah, the Chagas, the Gam shenimshachim b'mokem chutz, and Beraisa also transmits and is drawn to a place that's b'mokem chutz. And now he's explaining what that mokem chutz is. That it's Malchus as it goes into the Ayin Sorim that manifests in Noiga of Asiya. Not just, remember, Mishnah is primarily Chagas of what? Of Yitzira. Yes, it also comes into Asiya. But Beraisa goes all the way into the Malchus of the Ayin, the Malchus that manifests Ayin Sorim to refine the Noiga of Asiya. So Beraisa is involved more, goes more outward and more downward than Mishnah. That's what he's saying now. Anybody wants to ask something? Because I'll now continue reading. He continues to explain it.
At that point, they had, by the second temple, they had like Golus cup, so they had to go to Beraisa.
I wouldn't use the word Golus cup. I don't think is the right word to use here, but it's still part of the Talmud, part of the Torah. But yes, it's going down more downward. Now, the interesting challenge would be when we actually look at a Beraisa and look at a Mishnah, can we see this ourselves? If you were to compare the language in a Mishnah, language in a Beraisa, do you see this distinction that one is so-called on a lower level than Talmud? You could say is clearly much more explained and many more arguments, even though Mishnah also has disagreements and so on, but everything is far more condensed. So we'll see. We'll discuss that later. Meanwhile, let's just see how he dissects. And he's right now describing the anatomy of Beraisa. So let's continue. V'zel shene hapardus. So he's quoting now the pardus of the Ramosha Kordaviro, Ramak. So be'erech bar. Remember, bar means chutz in Aramaic. So the Pardes has a section where he actually goes through the etymology of different words, and he goes through Ayin Beis. We learned different. He cited the Pardes on different words earlier as well. You may mention Ma'ir also does that, but that's the Kabbalah of the Arizal. So the Pardes be'erech bar, next page 1372. So he says that that Erech Bar, the Pardes writes that betikunim pirish, tikunim means tikunim zeyar. So he's quoting the Pardes quotes from tikunim pirish, the word bar, ki atzadik shehu geile v'yeled mimkeme, a tzaddik, a righteous person, when he is exiled, displaced, v'yeled mimkeme, and he descends from his natural place. So a tzaddik, his natural place would be a place of Gedusha, of Torah. But just like when the Jews went into exile, it was displacement, leaving a place of Gedusha. So when a tzaddik is exiled and goes, the Yeled Mimkeme, and descends from his natural place, which means he goes down to a lower place, Mikrah bar, Loshen Beraisa. That's called bar, going outside. The language, Loshen Beraisa, the word term used for Beraisa. Ki atzadik, he's explaining, Ki atzadik ovad v'anar yechra v'yovash. Quoting a pasuk that's quoted, I think, in Eicha, where it talks about that tzaddik ovad, he got lost. Ovad means he's lost, he's displaced. He's no longer in his natural place. V'anar, the river, Yechrav, was destroyed, v'yovash, and dried up. So a tzaddik, like a fish in water, imagine a fish in water suddenly being exiled and driven out of its natural habitat. That's what a tzaddik is in Golus. He's driven out of his natural habitat, and So it's like compared to another that when it says the nor was destroyed and dried up, the he begela halacha. And that is the level of gela halacha, that the halacha is in a state of gela of Golus. Ad kan l'shene. That's the language he exactly cited, the word for word from the Pardes. So that's ad kan l'shene means they actually quoted it. So this is a quote to explain what the word bar means. So we see from this, it's not just a geographical and physical thing, it's a spiritual state. Beraisa is not just outside of the base medrash, as in teaching something outside of but it's actually a different lower level where a tzaddik and halacha, he's outside of his natural domain and in a state of exile. So bar Beraisa refers to that state. I want to just see if the Tzemach Tzedek, I don't think the Tzemach Tzedek brings this Pardes. Or maybe yes, I want to just see, 1 second. No, I don't think so.
I don't think so either. I'm doing word searches. I'm cheating.
It's fine. Okay, fine. The Rebbe Rashab is adding it. There's another mimer from the Tzemach Tzedek. And there he may, I don't think he brings the Pardes either. Okay, I'll look it up later. Okay, good. Any questions? Okay. So in the name of thoroughness, the Rebbe Rashab continues. Remember I mentioned Me'er. Now, Me'er is from Amer Papirash, another book of Kabbalah. This is, I mentioned a number of times. We quoted it a few times in just the past few pages, where he collects from all the places of the writings of the Arizal, Kisra Arizal, and puts it also in alphabetical order. So he says, Ayin Beis. Ayin Beis of course, bar. Simen Nun Gimel, or Simen Nun Gimel. What does he write? Bar hu hayesod kishu begolus. Bar is the level of yesod. That's what he's adding. So there's netzach heid yesod. When it's in a state of golus, lebar ma'asrei, outside of its location. Asrei would be its natural location. So yesod can be in its natural place. And remember, tzaddik, yesod, elam. Tzaddik and yesod are the same level. So it's very consistent with the Pardes, who talks about it as tzaddik, the level of tzaddik, but not tzaddik as he is in his own natural habitat, but how he's Golus lebar masrei. Malchus Mikrah is Beraisa. So when Yesod is exiled or displaced outside of its natural location, Malchus then is called Beraisa. Now, why Malchus? Because remember, Malchus, Mishnah is Malchus. It receives from Yesod. So when Yesod is outside of its natural place, the Malchus too goes down a level and it's called Beraisa, not Mishnah. Ad kan l'shene. So that's the actual language of the Me'er. So Rebbe Rashab is basically grounding and giving us the sources for the concept of Beraisa, what Beraisa is in contrast to Mishnah, of course. And now he's going to explain it a bit more. So he says, V'hu inyan, and this that we just said about being in Golus. So the Me'er does add something. It adds the Yesod and Malchus part. In the Pardes, he just mentions Tzaddik, and he just says Begela Halacha. But it's very consistent. They both very aligned with each other. Just different, using more terms in the Me'er. What is the inyan of this? Hu inyan ragleo yerdes. Okay, so there's an expression ragleo yerdes lamato. Ragleo is referring to the legs. When you say the posuk Hashamayim Kisi, va'oretz hadem ragli. So the Eibishter says that we say it in Haftarah every Rosh Chodesh, Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, So Hashamayim Kisi means heaven is my throne, and earth is Hadem Ragli, is my footstool. So Chassidus explains, Kisi refers to Malchus, Hashamayim Kisi, that Kisi refers to actually the world of Bria, but Shamayim Malchus is like the Kisei of the king, of the Adam Elyon, of the supernal man, the king. His throne is Malchus, and the Ragleo, the legs of Malchus go down into Biyah, and as a result, their where's their footstool is down in Biyah, but the expression Raglei Yerdis is used in Chassidus and Kabbalah, and in Kabbalah and Chassidus as referring to like a descent into Golus. Raglei Yerdis Lamato. Sometimes I think it's also referred to, sometimes they use the word moves. I'm trying to remember the exact expression. It's connected to things that are lower levels. So he says this is the level of Raglei Yerdis Sheyardo Lamata Ba'Asiya. So this revelation, obviously we have to make sure not to be anthropomorphic here. It's not talking about anything physical. It's just using, in Kabbalah uses physical terms to explain spiritual levels. So we have it, think of it as a muscle. When you look at our own body, it's just an example. So what does it mean in Ruchnius? It means that the revelation of Atzilus is not just going into Bria, Yetzirah, but all the way down into Asiya. Like he said before, there's not the 70 ministers, Noiga da Asiya. So we're talking about a level that has not remained. Remember, we talked about Torah and Atzilus is purely divine. It's divine spiritual levels. It's a divine blueprint. In Yetzirah, we learned it already starts taking on the shape of Nigla, of Halacha. It's still spiritual, but it's already talking about things that we can identify with in the material world, like we said, in Gashmis, Birurim, and so on. Then it goes even further into Asiya, and that's how he's describing it. So we find that, like Mikrah, we said, was Atzilus, that descends into Asiya. But originally in Atzilus, it's Elikus. If you remember, he said even the way back where was this on page 1370, when he said that Beraisa, one second. That's Teira Ruchnius. Oh no, I mean the page before actually. We said that even in Atzilus, you can't really say Shinuyim yet, because Atzilus is still radiates, what dominates there, even though it's a level of Nar, but in some ways it still dominates something that's above change and above the governance of the shifts of existence. That was on page 1369. But in Yetzirah, that's where Chagas takes on the real shape of din, of judgment, and of severities, and so on, because it's dealing more with the governance of existence, whereas Atzilus is still a level of Elikus. So just keep that in mind. That's what we're addressing here. How much the Torah is associating with this world. So Mishnah associates, Beraisa is even further, all the way Chutz, even in Golus. And that's what he's describing here. That's why Beraisas were at the time of the second Bayis Sheni, because then, even though it wasn't Golus yet, in the full sense of the word, the Beis Hamikdash still stood, but compared to Bayis Rishon, it was already descending to a lower level, and ultimately, after the destruction of the temple, it would descend even lower into real full Golus. So Raglei Sheyardo Lamata Ba'Asiya, Valkain, and that's why, because Beraisa, that's why Beraisa was needed. Valkain ho yitzrichim leberaisas, because now they were in a state down by Second Temple, they were in a state of a less revelation of the divine. That's why it necessitated, they needed Beraisa shu kitzer hashpa b'chinas helam, because to so-called condense the hashpa of Mishnah, which is a higher level of Chagas of Yetzirah. So that's why they needed Beraisas to condense some and to come b'chinas helam, more concealed, so they could be able to receive it. V'hainu, and this means shemetzad helam v'hester haKelipah be'elam Asiya, that do to the concealment and the covering of the Kelipah. Remember, Kelipah covers up the fruit within. It's a shell. So the more intense the Kelipah is, the more concealment in Elam Asiya. You cannot receive the revelation of Ki'im kasher bo b'ksara u'misalam. Only when it comes in a more summarized form, like we said before, you teach it to a lower student in a more summarized form, u'misalam, in a more concealed way, and it's concealed. V'hu inyan katnus umiyut hakelim. And that's the inyan of the diminished or the less developed and umiyut and diminished containers. So it's like teaching the Torah to a lower level. Additionally, v'gam, and additionally, in order for the Torah to be able to descend so low, hu dafke mebchinas nehi. That's dafke from the level of nehi. In other words, if it remains on the level of chagas, it can't descend that low, because chagas is a more intense revelation. U'kamoshin is boile il, as was explained earlier. The bchinas hapnimis ena yochel leided lamata kol kach. That the inner dimension can't come down that way. That's what we learned about Mikrah, because it comes from such a primis dika level, an inner dimension. I'm sorry. The opposite. When something is more pnimius and you don't, and it can't come down that low. The only thing that can come down low is nehi. That's why Mikrah, for it to come down, you need the nehi of Chabad. That's the way it can come down lower. If it would remain in its higher exalted state, it wouldn't be able to come down that low. So any Mishnah, Chagas. That's why Mishnah, which is the level of Chagas, his Gala Shalah who be Yitzira. Its revelation is in Yitzira. It can't go down further. The fact that it goes down into Asiya, we learned that it is a lower way. We're only getting the outer dimension of the Mishnah. But Mishnah in its full glory, he said this clearly on top of page 1368, that Mishnah stays in Yitzira. In order for there to be the Amshach in Asiya, that comes from the level of Nehi, Sheba Behelam, which comes in a state of concealment, to the point that it could also be the Amshacha in Asiya.
So this is like Mikrah?
He's going to now qualify the difference between Mikrah and this. The same qualification. It's different. Mikrah is due to its great high level, so the only way it can come down is through is Nehi of Chabad. He's now talking Nehi of Chagas, Nehi of the Tacht. He's going to qualify the difference between Mikrah and Beraisa right now. The next line, literally. Same like he did in the previous page. But the point being now is that we're bringing down Mishnah. We're bringing down the explanation of Torah to a lower level, even in Golus, even all the way into Asiya. And now he's going to qualify. Umuvin mezeh. From this we understand the eina daima kamay Mikrah, that this is not similar to the way it is Mikrah, Asiya. Now when we're talking Asiya, that the Mishnah and the Beraisa brings it down into Asiya, it's not similar to the way Mikrah is in Asiya. The Masha Mikrah Asiya, who adarab. The fact that Mikrah is in Asiya, on the contrary, who mipnei shei medrega nailis yeser. That's because Mikrah is a higher level. The whole Hagavei yeser, that which is higher, can come down lower. Ukamoshin is barely ill. Like he explained earlier, this was all the way back. We explained this on page 1365 and 1366. So Mikrah is a higher level. That's why it can come down. Only the Nehi of it, but it comes down. Here, we're talking the world of Giluyim that it's coming down, not because it's such a high level. Like you said, however, for Mikrah to come down, it can only be the outer dimension of the Elyon. Ulechena Mikrah, and that's why Mikrah, the verse, Hagam Shabar Rak Be'asius, even though it comes into expression only letters, like we said, stories, we only see the letters. Remember, he said Tansa. There's Tansa, Taimim Nekud, there's Tag and Asius. In Mikrah, on the Pshat level, all we have are letters. Letters means it's the outer dimension. Shagam Shabar Rak Be'asius Zeo Masha Niglo Lanu Kanal. That's what's revealed to us. Ubemaisa B'Pel Mamish. And in Mikrah, everything is Maisa B'Pel Mamish. You hear only the action in action, what the mitzvah is, without details, without explanation. U'Makol Mokem Nira, nevertheless, we see Nira Makol Mokem, sorry, Makol Mokem Nira B'Zeh Gili Elikus. Nevertheless, in Mikrah, you could sense, you could feel, you could sense and see the divine revelation. Kenira B'Chush, B'Teira Shebiksav, the B'Teira Shebiksav, Nirgish B'Zeh Elikus. Like we actually tangibly can see that in the written Torah, you feel godliness. Now, you could say the Rebbe Rashab feels it. Do we also feel it? So let me explain. I mentioned the other day this point. What he's basically saying is when you learn Gemara or Mishnah, even though maybe some people feel the divine in it, but what dominates there are the actual halachas. So for example, let's take the Mishnah the pasuk that talks about Krishna. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. What do you hear in that pasuk? So of course you could dissect it and explain the verses, but basically, listen, Israel, that God is one, the oneness of God. What do you hear when you learn the Mishnah, the first Mishnah in Shas? Now the Mishnah is not talking about the oneness, the godly revelation. It's saying technically, since it says that you have to say Shema when you wake up and when you go to sleep. So when? When do you actually say Shema? So you see here, the Mishnah is already much more bislapshus. It's dissecting more the legal, you can say the legal and technical and mechanical aspects of when you say Shema. Is there elikus in there? Of course. Mishnah is also godliness. But that's the difference between Yitzira and Atzilus. So in Mikrah, the main focus is what Hashem wants. So even people like us, we may not feel godliness, maybe like the Rebbe Rashab, our Rebbe would feel it, but that's what he's saying, that in Mikrah, even though you only have basic letters, you don't have explanation, but there's a certain divine transcendence that can be sensed there. That's essentially what he's saying. You feel the godliness in it. And actually, you could even say furthermore, it's precisely because the Mikrah doesn't explain it. If the pasuk would start going into the details, you wouldn't feel quite the same thing. So when you're learning Chumash or Mikrah in general, what you're getting is yes, there are letters, there are stories, but it's essentially much more of a godly dimension, much more godliness than seichel. Mikrah is not there is seichel. Rashi, the Ramban, the Even Ezra, they all dissect the verse and they explain what it means. But we're talking about the Mikrah itself. When you just read it, you're basically reading a godly narrative. And that's why it's not really driven by seichel so much. It's l'mayla masag. It's not irrational, it's super irrational. Just trying to explain a bit what he means here, that the nirgish elikus. So Mikrah is the exact opposite. It's not coming down into Asiya, bislapshus, like it is we're soon going to learn about Beraisa. We're talking here about a level that is so divine, it only can express itself in letters, in b'maisa b'pel mamish, but within it, you sense a higher state. So Mikrah elevates one. That's why when we marva the Sedra, Shnai Mikrah ve'echad Targum, you just read it. There's something about just reading the words. Or when we hear Kriyas HaTorah, when you Kriyas HaTorah, yes, you can look in the commentaries, but the main thing is to hear the verses stated. So like when we stand up, when we hear Anochi Hashem Elokecha, or other parts of the Torah, when we're reading the Torah, it's not so much about learning it, it's about hearing the words that are radiating with a certain Gedusha of Teresh Biksav, of Elikus that he's describing here. Mashenkin Braisis, so now that's the distinction. So Mikrah and Asiya is because of its greatness, so it's coming down only in an external level, but in that external level, it expresses Elikus. Beraisa also comes in Asiya. Mashenkin Beraisa Shebasihu Shebo Bis Almus. The Eina Nikah V'Nigla B'Zeh Ha'ed. Beraisa is the opposite. Beraisa is the world of Giluyim. The world of Giluyim, Beraisa is coming to explain the Mishnah in a way that a student that doesn't understand it so well needs to get it in a more concealed way. So it's more concealment than revelation. The Eina Nikah V'Nigla B'Zeh Ha'ed. Gam B'Pochas Mi B'Mishnah Kanal. Even less than it is a Mishnah. Mishnah is also not as much Gilui as Mikrah. But here we're talking even further because Mishnah is still Chagas of Atzilus, so there is some Gilui. But when it comes into Bar, like in Bayesheni, where it's coming into Asiya and to Golus, where the tzaddik is Gola, like you said before on top of the page from the Pardes Amer, here you need Beraisa because now the student is not able to receive the Mishnah. It's not due to the greatness of the revelation of Beraisa, but actually due to its coming down level. Very consistent to what he said earlier. It's not due to equality. It's due to bring it down to a lower level. Now, we'll qualify one important thing. Obviously, if you can bring it down to a lower level, that itself is a chiddush. And we learn sometimes that a teacher that can explain something to a child has a depth that a teacher that can't explain it is not there. But that's a separate discussion. That doesn't change the point. The Mikrah is not that. Mikrah is essential, such an essential divine place that it goes down to the lowest level, and we only get the outer dimension of it. Beraisa is a deliberate effort of bringing it down to the level of a lower level. So it's actually a state of Isalmus, like you said. V'hainu, let's just read till the end of this sentence. V'hainu, this means this is not Nihi of Chabad Mikrah. This is Nihi Shebetachten, Nihi of Chagas, Nihi of where Mishnah is Tachten. Shemiskatzer u'misalma er. That it condenses, and the and conceals the oir, u'mishumzehu bo ba'asiya. And that's why it comes to Asiya, into Asiya, because of its diminishment, not because of its greatness. That's the distinction between Mikrah and Asiya and Beraisa and Asiya. And with that, he concludes the subject of Beraisa. The next section, which I would have made a new paragraph, is Vihine Talmud. He's now going to go into Talmud, the third level. Mikrah, Mishnah, Talmud. He covered in Mishnah also Beraisa. So now we're going to move to Talmud. But we're going to stop here. It's a good place to stop. But any questions, any comments, anything?
That means that Mikrah is not reaching at all to us. That's why we're reaching only the
Elikus that reaches, yeah.
Right.
Like, for example, you can't take from Mikrah and come to understanding the halacha. In Beraisa Mishnah, you could. Yeah, that's the point, correct.
Because Mishnah is in a much lower level compared to, and that's why when we say that Mishnah is reaching Yetzirah, it's because it's in a lower level. Even though the Talmud is reaching Asiya, because in Talmud you don't reach the thing. Not Talmud, in Mikrah.
Mikrah, right? That's correct. Basically, I would say the difference between Elikus or Elikus Atzmius of Elikus and Giluyim. Mishnah and Beraisa focus more on Giluyim, meaning understanding, has Avana Vasaga. Mikrah is much more a Elikustic experience. So it comes from a higher place, goes down to Asiya because of its power, intensity, but its main, what in Giluyim, Mikrah, you don't have a lot of Giluyim. You don't have Avana Vasaga. Mishnah and Beraisa is Giluyim. In Giluyim, Mishnah is a higher Gilui. That's why you need to diminish it and explain more detail, diminish it and give more details and more helam for a lower student. So I think when you talk Etzem Giluyim would be a good way to contrast it. So both end up in Asiya, but it's a very different experience. When you dance, for example, Simchas Torah with a Sefer Torah, you're dancing much more with Mikrah. You're not dancing with a Gemara. When you Gemara or Mishnah and Beraisa, you learn. And in learning, there's the two levels. That's in a very Balbatisha way, you can distinguish between the two. But you want them both in Asiya. But one is more of a Gili Elokusum Chabad of Atzilus, that's L'mayla Ma'avona V'Asoge, all the way in Asiya, and one is in Giluyim, the Giluyim get diminished so we can understand it. So Beraisa is explaining Mishnah, and we're soon going to learn that Talmud is interesting what Talmud is. We'll get to that. I'm not going to jump the gun here. Yeah. It's a good way of putting it. Yeah, good way of explaining it. Any other comments, questions, anybody? Yeah, in the Tzemach Tzedek, he says that Mikrah is Nihi of Torah Shebiksav and Beraisa is Nihi of Torah Shebal Peh. Just to give a little additional language. But we still need to understand what Talmud is.
That makes it, summarizing it, very clear.
Yeah. Says that very explicitly right here. I just looked it up. Okay, so we'll stop here, middle of the page.